And let's clear it because we accidentally touched the lens. And welcome back to a new installment of Louis Loves Minis Mini Lesson, the series where we take a miniature portion of your time to teach you a small step on how to paint this mini. And we have finally built, cleaned, prepared, and primed this Space Marine from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And we are now ready to apply our first ever base coat. So we have our workspace and our miniature from the previous videos, and now let's figure out what tools we need to get this guy colored and beautiful. You have your paintbrush. And as newbies to the hobby, the common type of paintbrush that we will be using, or most hobbyists use, are synthetic round brushes. That's because synthetic brushes are accessible. While they don't last long, this is a cheap investment to figure out if this hobby is for you. Secondly, a round brush is the most flexible in terms of the kind of brush stroke you can produce. A round brush is basically identified as a type of brush that's round, yeah, and it comes up to a tip, and that tip can be manipulated for you to influence a type of stroke. If I want a straight line, I just put some pressure, and as you can see, the pressure makes the round brush a flat brush, making it easy for me to draw a rectangular stroke. But let's say I want to sort of have more control. With the same brush, I put less pressure but only draw using the tip, and I can make squiggles. Less pressure, finer lines, more pressure, thicker lines, and that's basically why we want a round brush. First, I need to show you guys how exactly we apply paint or load our brush with paint. And I utilize what I call a wet palette. A wet palette is, I actually don't have the definite term for it, but basically it's a palette that stays wet because the paint that we're using, which I'll get into later, tends to dry before we put it on the actual miniature. So having the paint put on the wet palette first keeps the paint moist, so you avoid wasting paint, making it easier to control and having a more pleasurable experience while painting. This is a DIY wet palette. It's basically an old Tupperware, and this is just basically parchment paper and a sponge underneath. And what I did is just filled up to the brim to where the thickness of the sponge is. What this actually does is that the sponge retains the water, and the parchment paper on top acts as a film to slowly bring moisture up to the surface where your paint is without over diluting the paint and just keeping it cool and wet while the paint from the bottle is here. Now, since you are new, I would recommend starting with a wet palette, DIYing this. It's basically all 100% kitchen stuff, kitchen sponge that I cut in half, sandwich or Tupperware that's very, very old, baking paper. Bam, you're done. Make sure it's waxless baking paper because wax baking paper prevents water from seeping through. Let's get some paint on the palette. The paint that I'm using is actually a locally made paint. This is called Armored Komodo. We will be painting this guy in the Blood Angels color palette or color scheme. That's why I chose a carmine red. You want to shake your paint because your paint is made out of three things: pigment, water, and binder or medium. Pigment is basically the color, which is red, and the binder is always acrylic, which is the medium, most commonly acrylic, and water. We add water for several reasons. Games Workshop Paints is more commonly known for their non-dropper bottles, which makes it quite difficult to put onto the palette. So I normally just open up really, really small, get a tiny, tiny bit, and then apply that onto our palette right here. And that prevents wastage. I'll get the paint straight from the palette, and then I will apply the paint without diluting it in water straight onto the thingamabob or the object. This type of application can be very tricky. So if you apply paint the way I did, you do see some paint clumps forming. And you don't want that drying in that way. When you apply a layer of paint that's not diluted with water, you may think it applied greatly because it's opaque, but when this dries, you will start to see clumps of paint on the side, and there'll be a texture that you don't want to see. That's why we water down our paint. How exactly do we water down the paint? I always keep a tub of water on the side over here. Clean my brush, and then I have towels to my left to always dry my brush. Now my brush is not exactly dry because there's just some water there, which is good. That means this is a damp brush. I get some paint that's straight from the bottle, meaning there's no water dilution. I scoop it up and put it on the side, and then I get some water, just a touch of water. You see that little ring? And then I water this down. Now I have a pile of undiluted and diluted paint. Because if I over dilute my paint, I might not be able to use it anymore, and I would have just wasted paint altogether. And you want paint to sort of be a little thicker than it is showing right now. If you can see closely, as I drag off the brush onto the palette, the water in the paint makes it more water-like. It pulls back. If I brush a square stroke or a straight stroke, you can see the water pulling back. And that's because of the nature of water. That means your water's over diluted, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but in the case of making a base coat, it is a bad thing. So what I would do is I would grab more paint from my undiluted paint, mix it to my water. Now look, when I spread it, the paint doesn't go back as much compared to the previous stroke. I can actually get more mileage from compared to this line over here and this line over here. This is a good water dilution of paint. When you choose the base coat you are applying, you choose either the color that is dominant, so in this case it's the Space Marine's armor. So let's apply our first base coat of watered down paint. So I can be a bit messy here since it's the first layer here, so I'll just brush on that really quick. And notice that I'm always pulling the brush down or away. I am never pushing up against the bristles. The moment I start pushing up against the bristles, I could potentially break my brush, and that's a bad thing because even though this is cheap, I don't want to break my brush in the middle of a session, because that might make things a little bit harder. Notice that I am always refreshing my paint. You will get to a feel of that the more you paint. You'll also notice that as you paint your first coat, it looks kind of ugly. It doesn't look like it's even. You may be questioning, maybe I watered it down too much. Maybe it's too thick. Maybe the dilution is bad. It's probably because you're painting a thin layer, which is actually what we are aiming for. Basically, you go over the entire miniature once, and then even if it looks ugly on the first turn, do not touch your paint the second time or while it's drying. Once you put it there, spread it out a bit, let it dry. Do not touch the paint while it's drying. That will definitely mess up the miniature. We're done painting both the backpack and the Marine, and you can tell he's still wet because he shines. When it dries, the water in the paint evaporates, solidifying that acrylic, making that paint dry. You can tell that some areas look a bit darker. They seem to show the undercoat or the primer, and some areas seem to feel like it's showing the right amount of red. That is the part that sort of tempts you as a beginner painter to touch that paint while it's drying. We are trying to water down paint so that we get the details to show up. We don't want our paint causing up any texture. But watering them down has this effect to make the paint look really thin and not opaque. The second coat gives it that more opaqueness or solidness to it. But because it's thinned down paint, we're not getting any brush strokes or texture. Go over the entire miniature with this technique and pass over the same way you did on your first coat. Now that he's dry and the first layer looks really even, you can now tell the difference of what I mean by applying two thin coats. You don't get the brush marks, you don't get those thick clumps of paint. You also retain the fine detail of the miniature, and you get an opaque color. That's what two thin coats gives you. Minimum two thin coats. When you're painting a Space Marine, normally after the first coat, which is your biggest portion, your power armor, you want to start painting the details or the smaller base coated areas. And normally that's usually the black bits. And when you get to smaller details, you would switch out from your big round brush and you would switch out for a nicer detailed round brush. Now, there are cheaper versions to this one I'm using, the Vincent Zwiever Kolinsky. But the reason why I like this paintbrush is because it keeps its point. And it's important for a detail brush or a smaller brush to keep its point. If I want to draw a line with the fine brush, the tip helps me do that because it retains that tip. But if I have a brush that's frizzled, which I normally use for bigger base coats, I won't be able to have that tip see, look at that, like it's so big, man. Look at the difference between those two. So while we're still base coating, you still have to be careful because there's an existing color you no longer want to mess up. And when you apply paint on this area, you want to make sure you don't get paint on this area. So just be careful, as we were a bit haphazard with the first application of red. We are on the second color and I don't want to mess up. Now you want to be very careful here because you don't want to touch the red paint like I just did right there. And if ever you do touch that red paint, wait for the black paint to dry and cover it up with red again. Tip here I would do is use the advantage of the shape of your brush. Because your brush is pointed or rounded, I come in at an angle like this and just make the brush match the shape of the miniature or the crevasse that it is filling so that it comes in one smooth stroke or motion. Now we have the black and the red in a fine, neat base coat. Now let's talk about metallic paint. Metallic paints has an additional material or ingredient to the paints that we have been normally using. This one has metallic bits, and if you were to apply this, you'd basically apply this the same way to the other paints. The only difference is that you would have a separate jar of water. This is for cleaning my brushes that have used metallic paint. I never mix it with this paint because the moment I get some metallic bits from here to this water, I don't want those metallic bits to fall into this water. Because imagine you're painting with brown, then you use your non-metallic brush or non-metallic water here. But if there's metal pigments there in that water, this will sort of have glitters on it. See the difference already. You've got the metallic shine. I'm going to apply some metallic paint onto, let's say, the cartridge of this gun, and I'm being very, very careful. I'm going to wick off some paint here. And that's another tip that I would say. If you're not sure how the paint looks on the miniature, if it's too thin or not, you can use your brush or your thumb and brush it on and test out how thin or thick your paint is. And now you have the metallic bits painted on. Notice I haven't painted all of the colors just yet, and there's a reason for that in the next video where we talk about darkening or adding shadows to the base coats to make it look a little bit more cooler and realistic and more scale-like. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this helps you guys paint more fine base coats onto your miniatures. This has been Louis Loves Minis, reminding you to hobby every day to keep the screws away. You can see the shine is not a flat surface. You can see ripples in that paint. When that paint dries, that will show the texture or the brush stroke. Whereas we painted this one that's a bit watered down. That's basically what we're trying to avoid. We want to make the base coat flat, even, not look painted.